from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome all of you to the 24th year of the North Idaho College Public Forum. With today's program, we commence that 24th year. It's difficult to believe that we've been on the air so long, but we're very pleased that that has been the case, and we invite you to be with us again over the next 12 months as we discuss what we believe are very informative and important issues as we have over the last 23 years. As we start this new season, I'm so pleased to welcome back on the panel the two regular members that have been with me for many years. And first of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney and a law clerk to a district judge in North Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I believe this is Janelle's about 20th year, and Steve, it's about your 10th or 11th. And we have a third panel member today. This is really interesting from a historical perspective. James Crow is with us, who was on the original panel with the late Marianne Lipshay 23 years ago. And after 20 years, he was there for 2 or 3 years, and then he has returned to be with us today and on next week's program. And Jim, it's a pleasure to have you back. And we thank you in front of the public for all that support in those early years when we were getting started. James Crow is a former professor of history at North Idaho College. He is a businessman, and he's also now an attorney. He's a doctor of jurisprudence. And Jim, congratulations. You've always been a person that stayed busy, and we commend you for what you have done. And now to our subject and our guest. We're going to, over the next 2 weeks, discuss something that's most current and very important and interest to you, and that is what's going on in Eastern Europe, the conflict in Bosnia, and the issue of the Serbs, and Croatia, and what else is going on, and the country that used to be Yugoslavia, and how it's broken up. And we have someone who has very deep roots. His family comes from that area. We welcome to the program Joe Pavlik to be with us this week and next week. Our guest is as to ancestry, is both Croatian and Serbian, and therefore has ties to explain some of these conflicts. Today, it is our hope and desire that we'll deal with this issue from a historical perspective. To attempt even to understand what's going on now, one needs to go backwards and to look at that history. We shall do that, and then if you'll join us again next week, we will talk about the current conflict, particularly what's happening in Bosnia, and the role the United Nations is playing in this area. It's moving so fastly, you need to know that we tape this program on September the 13th, and it may change some at the time it airs. Welcome to the program, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And so, as always, I will ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
Joe, it's important, I think, for our viewers to know what part of the world we're talking about. This is a real hot spot right now, but how would you explain to people what part of the world we're talking about?
Well, it would be east of Italy, across the Adriatic, and to the north, it's bound by Austria, and then further to the east, it's bound by Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and to the south, it's bordered by Greece.
And there is ocean front or sea front on this particular
the Adriatic,
part.
Well, Dalmatia, the Yugoslav that fronts on the Adriatic has a shoreline of about 225 miles.
So it's actually on the ocean.
On the ocean.
Now, can you also tell us something about the kinds of people that are there, the divisions of the country that are there as well?
Well, predominantly there's Yugoslavs, and Yugo is a Slavic word for South Slav. And then you have the Bulgarians, and they've been Slavified, so to speak. I mean, they originally came from the Volga region of Russia. And I think they may have preceded the Yugoslavs into that part of the Balkans. And over the years, I mean, they became more Slav than anything else. And a Bulgarian, well, he's an Orthodox. Serbian is Orthodox. Montenegrin is Orthodox. Romanian is Orthodox. And then we get into Romania. Not what I'm trying to say. Slovenia and Croatia and parts of Bosnia are Catholic. And we, the first Yugoslavs into that country, first South Slavs would be I'd say the Slovenes. And, you know, a migration is not like catching the red eye from Los Angeles to New York. Originally, they say that the Slavs, as a people, came from the southern part of Poland that bounds onto the Carpathian Mountains. And the first group of Slavs were the West Slavs. And they migrated west as far as the Elbe River in Germany. And they were subjugated by the Teutonic people. And there's no trace of the West Slavs outside of the Czechoslovaks. Then you have the East Slavs. They migrated east, Poland, Russia. Then the South Slavs were about the last people to migrate, and they flowed down through Thracia into, say, the Balkan Peninsula, and then up into the mountains. And then the Slovenes were the first of the group, and they were an agricultural people, and instinctively they were drawn to the, you might say, the alpine highlands of the Julian Alps, and they're the ones that border onto Austria. And then after them, the next group of Yugoslavs are the Croatians, and their Christian influence came from the West, say presumably from the Catholic Church, the papal curia, so to speak. And the Hungarians, they'd be the Catholics, the Romanians would be the Orthodox, the Bulgarians would be the Orthodox, the Serbs would be the Orthodox.
And when we say Orthodox, can you explain a little bit what you mean by Orthodox?
They were originally, you know, it's a little complicated, but your first Christianity, your first Christians were, the first emperor to embrace Christianity was Constantine in about 300 AD. And that's when Constantinople became the second Rome. And then that evolved into the Byzantine Empire. And they were more Latinate than anything else. And then along about, say about the 9th century, you had two, there's some disputes. They don't, St. Cyril, St. Methodius. And the Greeks claim them as their own. The Bulgarians claim them as their own. And they were the first people to convert the Slavs, or the Serbs, to the Orthodox faith. And then it was what they call the Eastern Church, as opposed to the Western Church. In about 1054, the schism between the Eastern and the Western Church developed. I mean, that was it. I mean, you had your Western Church, your Latinate Church, opposed to the Church of the East. And from that time on, it just, and then Serbia itself became a nation. It became a kingdom at about the beginning of the 13th century under a king called Stefan Nemanja. And that was the first of the dynasties, of the Serbian dynasties. And his son went into the church, and Sava, and it became Saint Sava, or Sveti Sava. And Sveti Sava is the patron saint of Serbia now. So you have the Serbian Orthodox Church, you have the Greek Orthodox Church, and you have the Russian Orthodox Church. So, like I say, circles within circles.
Steve Sheen.
Joe, I'm going to focus a little bit more on geography if I can.
Mm-hmm.
What we see now, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, all those spun away from what was until the breakup of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Take me back further then. How did Yugoslavia come to be?
Well, Yugoslavia came to be at the end of World War I. And just Croatia was a part of the Austro-Hungary Empire. Croatia, Dalmatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina. And when the war ended, well, Austrians being on the losing side, I mean, they divided things up. And the Serbs, the brave little Serbs, they took over. So it became, the monarchy resumed, and it was King Alexander II, and he was of what they call the Karađorđević dynasty, and it was first known as the Kingdom of Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. And what I'm trying to say is, prior to that, the dynasty that preceded the Karađorđević dynasty was the Obrenović dynasty. And unfortunately, he was more Austrian in his thoughts and philosophy than the Serbians cared for, so they handily they killed him and killed his wife in 1903, and they reinstalled the Karađorđević dynasty. And then from 1918 through 1941, the Croatians resented the monarchy, the Serbian monarchy, the Karađorđević monarchy, and because in 1929, King Alexander, he declared a dictatorship, and there, from about that time on, you had a terrorist organization spring up in Croatia called the Ustashi, and prior to that, they countered a terrorist organization that grew up about 1908 from Serbia called the Narodne obrane, the People's Defenders. And they were the firebrands, and they fought each other constantly. And then Croatia and Slovenia chafed under the rule of the Serbian king. See, the Serbian High Command was almost primarily all Serbian officers, and the Croatians resented it, as did the Slovenians. And the Montenegrins, being Serbians, they went along, you know.
Let me push you back a little bit further. And what you've been telling us, I think, is that in a way, the modern day map of this region is reverting back to what it was about World War I. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned earlier, during some of Janelle's questions, we talked a little bit about the Christian groups that are in the area. Mm-hmm. Much of the conflict, and we're going to talk more about that next week, but much of the conflict seems to be between Christians and Muslims. Tell me, in the days before the Austro-Hungarian Empire, how Muslims came into the area.
Well, you can date it right down to the day, the month, and the year. June the 28th, 1389. That's when the Ottoman Turks overcame the Serbian army in Old Serbia, a place called Kosovo Polje, the plains of the Blackbird. the plain of the Blackbirds. And, well, Serbia at that time was, it wasn't a kingdom. They had Tsar Lazar. After the death of the last Nemanja king, Serbia itself had disintegrated into little duchies, so to speak, or duchies. And so this Tsar Lazar, he was a prince of one of these small principalities, and he was elected. And his career was extremely short, so to speak. I think about 3 years. So he chose to defend Kosovo against the Ottoman Turks. Well, in one day, he had almost 80,000 Serbs were annihilated, and Serbia and Yugoslavia went into about 500 years of darkness.
Joe, let me stop you there, and I want to, Tony, let me ask one more question so we get to Jim Crow real quickly. We've talked about the Christians, we've talked about the Jews, mm-hmm. other ethnic or religious groups in the area, and I'm probably missing a bunch of them, but as we were talking before the show, there's a Jewish population in the region, and there's also
Gypsies.
Gypsies, thank you very much, Jim. That group, are they sort of the itinerant residents of Eastern Europe? How did they get, and the Jewish populations?
Well, I think the Jewish population, like I was telling Jim here a while back, the largest Jewish population outside of Tel Aviv was Salonika, which is now Salonika, Greece. And that stems from about 1492, when Isabel and Ferdinand expelled the Sephardic Jews from Spain. And they were welcomed into Salonika, or Salonika, or whatever they call it. And up until 1941-42, you had 150,000 Jews in Salonika alone. And then with the Holocaust, I think now You'd be lucky if you had maybe, say, 10,000 Jews. And in fact, some of the Israelis claim that Salonika is the mother of modern-day Israel.
Very interesting.
And then you have little pockets of Jews in Yugoslavia. I mean, there are people, you know, that to survive, they had to go here, they had to go there. So,
The Jim Crow.
Thank you, Tony. And it's always a pleasure to be back with you again. I hope we can do this every 25 years for a while.
We'll have you back sooner than that.
Joe's a very dear friend of mine for many, many years, and I think what Steve and Janelle have done is sort of given us a good start on this thing. Joe, what we have is a Balkan country that's been the crossroads of all of the warfaring tribes and invaders, and some come to settle. You're talking about the South Slavs, and they came in about the 7th century, I believe you said, and they were probably converted to Greek or to the Byzantine Orthodoxy, which was a Christian Orthodoxy about the 9th century, I believe. And from that point on, this was the religion that was in that area. We didn't have any of the Muslim religion. We did have the gypsies, or as the Spanish call them, the gitanos. We didn't have, we had the Jewish religion in there at that time. But we were really talking about the Orthodox Byzantine Empire that had come in and had the influence. And they created what was called satraps in there, or influences of all these people. And then I think we need to identify the Croatians, the Bosnians, the Serbians, the Herzegovinans, the Montenegrins, the Dalmatians, the Illyrians, and I think we need to talk about those a few moments. Would you do that, Joe?
Sure. Well, all right. We'll start with Slovenia and Croatia.
Good.
Northwestern part of what is now, or what used to be Yugoslavia. Slovenia is the first country that borders on Austria proper. And in fact, I think they're only about 40 or 50 miles from Vienna. And then the next country down from Slovenia would be Croatia. Slovenia and Croatia are Catholic. The Slovenes were the first ones to be Christianized. They were Christianized by German missionaries and later by Austrian missionaries. And the same thing holds true for the Croatians. And then we cross the Sava River, and then you're into Orthodox country. And it'd be the Serbs, the Montenegrins, and Bosnians, and then the Dalmatians. They were more Latinate than anything else. I mean, they're Catholic because they're part of Croatia. But a lot of the influence in Dalmatia right now will be Italian, more than, say, Roman Catholic. Well, they're Roman Catholic, but they're more of the Renaissance Italian than anyone else in Yugoslavia. And then the trouble with Yugoslavia, there were so many mountains. You see, you got the Julian Alps, you got the Dinaric Alps, and the mountains run almost, say, from northwest to southeast. And what they've made, they've cut off this country, I mean, this particular province from this province, this little republic from this republic, like Montenegro, see, you have the six republics. You had 6 republics in Yugoslavia. You had Slovenia, way to the north, Catholic. Croatia, Catholic, way to the north. Then you came down to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and predominantly Orthodox with a large Muslim population. Dalmatia is part of Croatia. Then you cross, like I say, you cross the Sava River, which would be the boundary between Serbia and Croatia. And then you have the Serbian Orthodox Church. And you'd have the Serbs and the Montenegrins and the Bulgarians. I mean, the Bulgarians are not Serbians, or, you know, they're not part of Yugoslavia, but they are of the Orthodox faith. Macedonians are of the Orthodox faith. And then right smack in the middle, right off the Adriatic coast, you got this little independent state of Albania. And they are definitely not Slavic. They are what descendants of the old Illyrian people.
That's part of the old Roman Empire, the Illyrians.
Way before.
Yeah.
In fact,
May I ask one more question, Tony? One of the things that I wanted to get to when we identified these various groups of people is the fact when the Ottoman Empire came in, the Ottoman Empire was the empire that replaced the Byzantine Empire. Christian, they changed it over and became a Muslim. Then when they came in the 1400s, if I'm not mistaken, Joe, is that not so?
1452, I
Yeah,
think the
14.
Ottoman Empire conquered.
They were there for
Constantinople.
500 years,
Yeah.
and when they came in, they introduced the Muslim religion, and 12.5% of the people, I believe you said today, in all of this area are Muslim today. Now, isn't it a fact that in Bosnia and Serbia and Herzegovina, you now have Muslims, and you now have Orthodox, and you now have Roman Catholics, all living in the same area, and you can't really tell them apart other than the fact that they are there. You have the Gypsies living there, and then you have some Jews living there. But I guess isn't this where part of the problem has come about? Because the Serbs, who are mostly Orthodox, want to be all Orthodox, and they want to get rid of the Catholics and everybody else, and the Catholics over here, who are all Roman Catholic, would like to get rid of the Orthodox. Is this right or wrong?
Yes, primarily, I think the conflict in Bosnia right now is not so much between the Serbs and the Muslims. It's a continuation of the struggle between the Croatians and the Serbs. And historically, the trouble you have in Bosnia right now don't have to go back any more than 50 years. See, when the Germans occupied Yugoslavia in 1941, and Croatia declared itself an independent republic, and Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, and they held dominion over Yugoslavia until about about September of 1944. Bulgaria and Belgrade were liberated by the Red Army and the partisans. So, but a lot of the trouble started, like I mentioned, the Catholic terrorist group called the Ustashi, and that was headed up by someone by the name of Pavlic, my name, no relation, and they, if you listen to the Serb, they committed some of the worst atrocities of any people on earth. That's the Croatian Ustashi against the Serbian minorities living in Croatia. And the Serbs to this day claim that the Croatians killed 750,000 of their own people.
Joe, we're getting very short on time, and I do want to get one other thing in from a historical perspective. I think one thing that confuses the people in the United States is that we tend to look at conflicts around the world, and oftentimes correctly so, that it's very simple. There's Group A and Group B. There's two groups in the conflict. That is not the case in what you're describing. It's much more complex, and they are many different groups that are very divided from a very long historical perspective. So I have a two-part question. The first part would be, is this division of these various republics or provinces based upon an ethnic and a religious background? That those are the two things that historically have done. Is that correct?
Primarily. And right now, I just like Milovan Djelas, he was one of Tito's strongest, staunchest allies until he was imprisoned. And he said that the divisions now are almost economic. See, because of the two of the most prosperous republics in Yugoslavia would be Slovenia and Croatia. Technically, they're a lot more advanced than Serbia. And a lot of it you can lay on the doorstep of Tito, this thing of Titoism, you know, the fabulous 5-year plans that the Russians had, you know, prior to World War II. Well, Tito was going to do the same thing, you know, this taking a peasant economy overnight, building a heavy industry.
But is this complicated with the fact that you indicate that the Croatian and Slavian areas are most prosperous economically, but Serbia is the one with probably the greatest military, the strongest army, And therefore, does that create
Well,
a different kind of-
numerically, they outnumber the Croatians 2 to 1. See,
Yeah.
the population of Serbia is roughly 8 million people.
Another thing that you said to me when we were getting ready for this show a few days ago, and we can identify with that in this country, you gave the example that on the East Coast, in places like Kentucky, the mountain peoples feud, like the McCoys and the Hatfields.
Yeah.
Is that a kind of comparison that the mountain people of this area are still have very, very long memories?
Long memories and short fuses is just about the way you could describe the Yugoslavs, really. I mean, just, well, give an example. My father was born in this little region called Lika, which is Croatia, and it borders on to Bosnia. And my grandmother, she was born there too, 1876. And my grandmother called herself Serbian. My father, he didn't, well, my father died when I was 6 years old, so I didn't know too much of it. Whatever I knew about my father, or about this part of the country called Lika, I had to learn from my uncle. And my uncle, for some reason, he was reluctant to say anything about the old country. And I asked him once, when he was about half in the cup, I says, how come you and my father came to this country? He says, well, he says, we had some bad trouble with a drunken Hungarian. He said, real bad trouble. And he never elaborated on it. So I think when he and my father came to this country, it was more than a political refugee or someone looking for a better life. It was a matter of survival.
We have only about 1 minute left.
Okay.
But during a lot of our lifetimes, there hasn't been as much conflict in this area because Marshal Tito and his communist regime rule with an iron hand, and the different ethnic and racial or religious conflicts were under control with his incredible strong-arm tactics. With his death, is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this erupt again?
You started getting dissension, even like I say, Milan Jealous, even in the 50s. He could see where Titoism was not working. In fact, I told you, my uncle, you know what he said about Tito? He says, Tito was the smartest man in Europe because in 25 years, he was going to turn gold into lead. And, you know, it just about happened, too.
On that note, we're going to have to bring our program to conclusion. Joe Pavlik, thank you for being with us, and our panel, we thank you very much, and we look forward to having you back next week. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a historical discussion of that region of the world and its conflict. Next week, we're going to get very current and talk about what is happening now in the conflict and the role of the United States, the United Nations, and NATO. I hope you will be with us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Before we start today's program, on behalf of Lindy Turner and our staff and our panel, we have to sadly report to you the loss of one of our staff who's been so dedicated to this program and all at North Idaho College, and that is Mike Johnson. He died suddenly of a heart failure, and we do extend our sympathies to his wife, Rose Johnson, and the entire family. He contributed much to this program, and we are very much saddened by his death. Last week, for you who were with us, we did our first week of a 2-week series on what is going on in what we would call the Serbia, Bosnia, Croatian conflict at this present time, and the role that the United Nations, NATO, is doing in that particular conflict. And for you who were not with us, we did a rather in-depth historical background of this region and what's happened over many, many hundreds of years. We wish to welcome back to the program today our guest from last week, Joe Pavlik, and we thank you for what you did last week, and thank you for returning to talk about the present conflict and helping us understand more what is the divisiveness and all the factors that are involved. Joe is certainly got deep roots in this part of the world. His family is part Croatian and part Serbian, and so therefore he has a real history. And Joe, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at Idaho College. And it's just a warm welcome to James Crow, who's a visiting panel member. And for you who weren't with us last week, James Crow, along with the late Marianne Lipshay, were the first two panel members on this program and served us the first 3 years. And we had many great, wonderful insights together in interviewing our guests. And Jim is an attorney. He's also a former history professor at North Idaho College, and he is a businessman. Jim, it's a pleasure to have you back again.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be back.
Before we get to our guest, because of your background in history, and you worked with Joe in preparing this program, Jim, I'm going to ask you to take us through some demographics that would be helpful to the viewers before we get into some of the details of the conflicts going on in Bosnia and the surrounding areas, if you would do that at this time.
I would. Tony, I think this is tantamount to really trying to understand what was going on, or what is going on there, and I've got a little information here I'd like to share with you. And the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1991 was about 4,364,000 people. Interestingly, of that number, 43% of those are Muslim, 31% are Serbs, and 17% are Croatian. Well, the Serbs are the Orthodox Christian, but this is going to reverse if we go back over and take a look at Croatia, just to give you an example of these two. And I think there's about 10 million in total in the Balkan area we're talking about. But in Croatia in 1992, the population was 4,784,000, and there 75% were Croatians and 12% were Serbs. But of the Croatians, the large majority of those Croatians would be Roman Catholic, and that's where our problems are coming in. It's the ethnic, as well as the religion, and the conflicts. And then, as Joe will bring this out to you a little later. And by the way, the literacy rate in Croatia was almost 96%. I think that's pretty impressive. You're not dealing with a bunch of peasants anymore. But anyway, is that enough demography for you?
That helps us understand some of the relationships. We'll ask Janelle to continue the questioning.
Joe, you have helped us understand a lot about this area of the world, but you liken it to a feud that's going on. Can you expand upon that a little bit? It's an old feud, and it's a relatively recent feud.
It's an old feud. Like I say, my father and my grandmother, or my mother's folks, come from this little region of Lika. Well, the Croatians have occupied that from time immemorial, so to speak. And the Serbians are fairly new to that region. They're new from about the first decade of the 19th century. The Serbs in Serbia rose up against the Turks, and the Turks put them down with some very brutal reprisals. So a lot of the Serbs, to escape massacre by the Turks, fled across the Sava River into what is Croatia. And they became, you might say, guests, but reluctantly. They were accepted as guests, and the stipulation is, we'll accept you here in Croatia, but we want you as frontier guards to save us from Turkish raids across the Sava River into our country. So, and then this part of Lika, it's not noted for prosperity, believe me. They exist on what we call poljes. Poljes is our word for meadows, or little open spots, that are arable. But in Lika, the soil is only about deep. And the joke among the other Serbians in Yugoslavia, among your Serbs and your Bosnians, they always kid the Serbian Ličan that he never tasted beef until he came to America, which there was more poetry than truth to it. But go ahead.
So what you're saying is basically that there have been a lot of atrocities committed against people
yes.
over the years, and that has led to the feud. You also, before the show, likened it to our own Civil War in part. Can you expand upon that a bit?
In this sense here, I mean, you have a central government. Preserve the Union. In other words, Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic is trying to say, hey, this is a nation, this is Yugoslavia, we have to stay together. So what you have, I mean, you have Alabama, you have South Carolina, and you have Texas. No, states' rights. You know, we will govern our own affairs. You know, we do not want.
That's a good example.
And a lot of it, that even goes way back. It goes back to 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. That these western Pennsylvanians, they were making whiskey. It was cheaper to send whiskey down the Ohio and the Mississippi River to sell to New Orleans than it was to send bulk grain. But federal government stepped in. He says, you have to pay a tax on that. We have to pay a tax in specie. You can't pay it in barter.
So you're saying, well, that's the same thing now.
Yeah, it's the same thing. See, in other words, their separation right now is more economic than anything else.
Now, you indicated also that there are some language differences, too, as well, between the people.
Not especially, no. I mean, like I say, you take a Serb, a Orthodox Serb, a Croatian, and a Muslim Serb, you send them at the same table. The only difference, I lived among Muslim Serbs in Chicago when I was a kid. And you'd walk into one of the kafanas, and where the Catholic Serb, or the the Catholic Croatian, or the Orthodox Serb, he'd say, "Hvala Bogu," thanks to God. You walk into a kafana, and you see these Muslim Serbs sitting at the table. They don't say "Hvala Bogu," they say "Hvala Allah." They speak Serbo-Croatian, but a different God. So,
what kinds of writing, then, do they do?
the Serbs and your Bosnians, they use the Cyrillic, like the Montenegrins and the Bulgarians. It's your Russian alphabet. And your Croatians, they use the Latin alphabet, what we use. The Poles, the Czechs, and the Croatians, they use the Latin alphabet. The Russians, the Serbs, and the Bulgarians use the Cyrillic alphabet.
So
And
things are
that
printed.
the Cyrillic alphabet was developed by the two monks, St. Cyril and St. Methodius. Those are the people that converted the Eastern Slavs into Christianity. See, prior to that, I mean, they had their tribal beliefs. And then it's a little hard to say when the Orthodox broke away from the Byzantine faith. But I think Byzantine as an entity disappeared in, 1452 is when the Ottoman Turks came back through Bulgaria after the conquest of Serbia, and they captured Constantinople, and from that day on, Constantinople has been Istanbul. It's been Turkey.
Steve Sheen.
Joe, and we've got lots of expertise around the room. In addition to yours in the region, we have a historian and a political scientist. So if I get astray here, I know I'm going to be corrected. But in my recollection, the real intense fighting in this region is fairly recent, last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the breakdown of the Soviet Union, which I guess gave the peoples of this area an opportunity to really get back at one another again, although their animosities are ancient, that was in 1991. Was there some flashpoint, some event since 91 that really touched off the intensity of the fighting in the region today?
I think I could give it, I'd say yes. I can give one date in Serbian history. That one date has precipitated one war that killed 20 million people, and it was also, like you say, the flashpoint of Slobodan Milosevic's cry to arms against the oppression of Serbian minorities in Bosnia and Croatia. And that would be June the 28th, 1389. That was the Battle of Kosovo. And June the 28th, 1914, you had a Bosnian youth, Serbian Bosnian youth, Governor of Princip, 18 years old. He assassinated Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. That was World War I, and so you had an 18-year-old Bosnian Serb precipitated a war that killed 20 million people.
Now take me to 1993 or 4 when the
but
fighting...
This is a point I'm trying to bring up. A lot of people don't realize the significance of that date, June the 28th. Now see if this young Bosnian would have assassinated Franz Ferdinand, say, the day before, the day after, it would have been taken by the Austrians as a random act by some fanatic, and it wouldn't have been as important. But the Austrians realized June the 28th, 535th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. The Serbs are defying us. So let's make an example of the Serbs. Now the Serbs could say, well, he was an idiot kid. We want nothing to do with him. But being June the 28th, one of their most sacred days, they couldn't denigrate his actions because that would have chipped away the importance of June the 28th, 1389. All right. On June the 28th, 1989, that was the 600th year anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. And that's when Slobodan Milosevic made a speech at the Kosovo Polje. He says, we will never, never let anyone dominate us again. So there we go. Okay. Hey, the Croatians, the Muslims, they're giving Serbs, they're giving our people a bad time. Let's go to their defense. And it's the same ploy. Germany took Czechoslovakia by going to the aid of the Sudeten Germans. They grabbed up Czechoslovakia. World War II started. Germans went in to help the Germans living in the Polish corridor start World War II. So, and it's a system people have of justifying a war or a raid, you know.
Joe, is there a date, though, in the 1990s, since the breakdown of the Soviet Union, where the real fighting started, some single event that...
No, not really. I mean, you had little flashpoints here, there, you know, and it's just an aggravation. I mean, maybe even had a little border clash here, and say, in a kafan or something like that, a Serbian may have said something to a Croatian, and boom, you know. Man, just the thing about it. See, Serbia, in World War I, World War II, they held a high moral ground. I mean, they held the high ground morally, so to speak. I mean, here the whole world looked in 1914. This small nation of some 8 million people taking on the dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary, and for a while, they held their own. And boy, you know, the people of the West, what a brave little nation. World War II came along after Bulgaria and Hungary and Romania signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. Here came Hitler in to Belgrade, and he approached Regent Paul and wanted to sign a non-aggression pact. And what happened then, to this day, they call it the diaper revolt. The school children of Belgrade rose in opposition to this pact, and they in turn were joined by the Serbian High Command. And August the 6th, Germans send over 240 bombers, and they bombed Belgrade, killed 17,000 people, and the same day they invaded Yugoslavia. Well, the Yugoslav government lasted another 17 days, or another 11 days, and they formally surrendered. But they fought for another 4 years after that. And that's the tragic part there. You had the Chetniks. They were Serbians. See, Chetnik is a word, say, for a common soldier. The divisions in the Yugoslav army were Cheta, with approximately 100 men. So if you're a Cheta, you know, if you belong to a Cheta, you were a Chetnik. So Draže Mihailović was a Serbian general in the Serbian High Command. So he took over the first resistance against the Germans. And then he in turn was joined by Tito, who led a coalition of not only Serbians, but Croatians, Bosnians, Muslims, and they formed, they worked in uneasy alliance against the Germans. And then the Chetniks became more imbued with fighting against the Catholic Ustashi than they did anything else. So England, and the Allies, they supported Chetniks first, because, well, the monarchy, that appealed to Churchill and the Royal House of Windsor.
Joe, thank you. That's a great military history lesson.
James Crow.
Yeah, Joe, I think one of the things that Steve was really referring to was after the Russian breakup, we had some of the little smaller countries. I think Yugoslavia at one time was made up of Croatia and Bosnia and Dalmatia, Serbia, Montenegro, a little part of Macedonia. And they started about 1991. They started moving toward their independence, as you were talking about earlier, going back to the old American Whiskey Rebellion and all that. And as they were going to their independence, then that's when the Serbs joined with the old Yugoslavian army that was in effect and started attacking, trying to force them to stay into the fold to keep the Yugoslavia. And at this point is when we get into the ethnic cleansing, which is what's going on today. And I think maybe this is what Steve, and I know this is what I'd like for you to do, is to discuss this concept of modern day 1991, 2, 3, 4 ethnic cleansing. Why are they trying to accomplish this and what's going on?
I have no idea.
Well, right.
I really don't.
You really don't. What does ethnic cleansing mean?
Well, just wiping out someone you don't like. It's not part of the clan.
Well, one of the recommendations, Joe, that I read then was that they tried to set up 12 provinces over there and moving each group, whether they're an Orthodox Serb or a Catholic Serb or a Muslim Serb, into one little segment area. Would that work?
Wouldn't work. Well, you have the West Bank in Israel. That it doesn't work. When Israel became a sovereign state in 1948, I believe, and the Palestinians were shut out. Palestinians have been living in relocation camps for, 40 years now.
So you're saying the same thing would be taking place here?
I mean, here's the thing, it just, arbitrarily, it's very simple to say, well, okay, we have Bosnia here, here's what we'll do. We'll take a line, we'll run it north and south. You Serbs, you move to that side. You Bosnians, you Croatians, you move to that side. But it's a mountainous country. You get, say, one little village that's been Muslim for 500 years. You go over to the next valley, you have a village that's been Serbian for 500 years. And maybe they're both on one side of the line of demarcation. And which one are you going to tell to move? I mean, you're going to break up, and it'll start all over again, And I've heard so many people say in this country, well, what you ought to do is give them all guns and let them kill themselves. But somehow, I think we better be concerned about that. It's not some squabble that we should understand and then forget and go back to wondering about a point spread between the San Diego Chargers and Denver Broncos. I mean, this may have a bearing on the 21st century. I have a feeling, maybe I'm pessimistic, but I'm afraid the 21st century is going to be a xenophobic century. We're beginning to see a little bit of it in the United States. We're concerned about a 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico, a border that's more a civ than anything else. Like they've had a famine in northern Mexico for the last 5 years. The people are getting hungry. They're not going to go south. They're going to run into the same problems. Where are they going to go? Go north. And I think the 21st century, the emotions are going to come from the belly, not from the mind. And say, at the beginning of the 20th century, we stopped being Homo sapiens. We've gone back to being Homo erectus. We're going back to the cave. And maybe I'm old, maybe I'm pessimistic, but that's just the way I feel.
Let's talk a little bit, Joe, about the balance of power between the groups right now. One of the debates in the United States has been about the fact that I think we can safely conclude that Serbia, from what Jim has told us on population and the military left over from Marshal Tito and all, that Serbia has the strongest military army in the region right now, and maybe Croatia is next.
But I feel they're retreating, because for 3.5 years, you know, I mean, they've employed some awful heavy ordnance.
Yeah. But
And
my point I'm trying to get at is, though, that it's my understanding that the Russians have provided weaponry for Serbia, and for whatever the reasons are, and I'm not the one with the wisdom, but there's been an arms embargo against the Bosnian government people. Has that shifted the balance of power? In other words, is there a problem with that? And now that the bombings are taking place with NATO and the United Nations on the Serbs, I know that you're saying that we're not going to be able to solve all the problems with this long historical fact, but is there some kind of balance of power that can help in some way?
They're just going to have to sit at the table. They're going to have to overcome at least 500 years of enmity. You know?
But I guess the point I'm hearing from national leaders in this country that are on different sides of the issue, can you sit at the table and reach agreement unless all the factions feel that they have an equal balance? If one side of the many sides feel they have an upper hand, will they go to the table?
I think they will. I think if the Serbs realize that they do not enjoy the favor of the West, they may defer, because right now you're hearing accusations coming out of Serbia that the United States is beginning to arm your Croatians. And say about 3 or 4 weeks ago, you noticed the Croatians started invading right from the little province I came from Lika. And what started out as a Serbian rout, or a Bosnian rout of the Muslims, turned into a retreat when the Croatians came in. And the Croatians come in not out of any altruistic designs to save the Muslim Serbs. I mean, I don't think they could care less. But, you know, hey, we will not let the Serbs have the upper hand, say militarily speaking.
Balance power.
Balance of power.
I got to bring Jim Crow in on this, because Jim taught Western civilization, and Jim, you know, if you go back in history and look at the try for balance of power in Europe, and Great Britain would sit back and wait to see which the weaker one would join their forces. Would you like to comment on this struggle and how that might become part of the settlement?
Yeah, I think, Tony, in doing some additional research after you invited me to be on this panel, I think that what's going on today, that the only way we will get everybody to the table is by the United Nations taking an active, strong hand. The United Nations has been very weak over there for the past several years, and now for the first time we're using the cruise missile. We're doing bombing in there, and it's trying to force the heavy artillery out of the area, which is destroying the civilians. Once they can do that out, they may be able to get people back at the table. But going back to what Joe says, we have 500 years of animosity that we've got to sit at the same table with. And I don't know, but I think that if you don't have a balance of power, you'll have an ongoing warfare forever and ever there, and it's been going on. And if you do have a balance of power, the balance of power has to come from the Americans as well as the Russians. And the Russians are screaming now because their Slavs, their South Slavs, are getting the brunt of the attack, which is the Serbians. And the Russians are screaming now. And what happened in Moscow last week, if you recall, when they shot the American embassy up, to me, this is a pandemic problem as opposed to just an epidemic in itself.
I should point out to our viewers we're taping this on September 13th, and other things might happen. Joe, one more question to you in responding to what Jim Crow just said. Even if we are successful through all these forces in the United Nations and getting some kind of peace settlement, and you're indicating that some villages and all will not want to move, are you optimistic that it will last, or will it just be temporary with this long history?
They'll exhaust themselves, and they'll have a little rest period and start up again in another 50 years. But like I say, I'm beginning to be pessimistic about the 21st century.
Let me add something on that line. If we don't find some temporary solution here, Is there a chance that this will expand into a greater war throughout Europe?
I begin to worry about that. Now, Jim seems to think that the next problem will be Macedonia.
Yes, I do.
But it's my feeling, it won't be Macedonia. It'll start with Albania. Because Kosovo, there's 1.5 million Albanians living in the autonomous region of Kosovo, which used to be old Serbia. But Kosovo was also the shrine of the Serbian nation, the Battle of Kosovo. And since 1980, you've had an Albanian, what they call intifada. In other words, a resistance against the Serbs. So, and the Yugoslav government has gone into what is now the region of Kosovo. They've built universities, they've built soccer stadiums.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we only have a minute left. And I do want to ask Jim one other thing on that, because he has a different position. If this does expand, who else might come into the war in less than a minute?
Well, the Russians have a very good possibility of wanting to come into the war, I think. In closing, Tony, I want to say one thing. Anybody that wants to understand this history should read the book, The Bridge on the Drina, by Ivan Andrić. And he was a Nobel Prize-winning writer from Yugoslavia. And I read this under the recommendations of Joe, and it's outstanding. It's the history of a bridge 500 years old, and all the people around it for that 500 years.
That's a good note on which to end so that our viewers can proceed to follow up on this. Joe Pavlich, thank you so much for being with us. Jim, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Visiting panel member in our regular panel. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a 2-week series on something that's most current and very important. I think you'll hear a lot about in the future. I hope you found this informative. That was our intent. And I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will discuss yet another important issue of our times. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.